Good afternoon and welcome to After Hours. Joining us today at the Main Inn Resort and lovely cottage is Joey Hartman, who has stayed at these cottages before.
Yes, I have.
So it's no surprise to you what they're like.
No.
Now, I was going to say you're on the board of the Council of Canadians and you want to be called a labor activist. It's interesting because I was talking to somebody who I thought was a political activist, and he didn't want to be called that. He wanted to be called a community worker. So why do you want to be called an activist? Yeah.
Well, I guess I started as an activist in the labor movement in Vancouver in 1980. And throughout my time since that, over 40 years, I think that I've always approached the work that I do as a volunteer or as a paid staff person for a union or as a volunteer board member with the Council of Canadians as a form of activism. You can call it political activism. Most of my work has been rooted in unions and the labor movement, and so that's how I position myself. And I like to think of it as not an academic thing, but the activist word is really important to me. It's about doing.
To me, it signifies action, and in a good way.
That's what I hope to.
Now, I've always thought of the Council of Canadians as a political group. What is the Council of Canadians?
Well, it is a political group. It's nonpartisan, overtly nonpartisan. It doesn't associate with any political party, and yet its ambitions and efforts are all politically linked because it tries to change the world for the common good. And so its focus is on areas that are really about the commons. It's about protecting water. It's about democracy.
I think they were very vocal with free trade and
very much. Mulroney, it was a foundation
and yes. The whole water issue.
Yeah, and I think 36 years ago it was formed around the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement that was being formulated at the time, and the risk that they saw that posed to sovereignty for Canadians, and so that was its foundation. And I think what I really like about it is that it is a national organization that strategically works on these issues on behalf of all Canadians, but it also does the grassroots up. So there are chapters across the country of, regular folks who care about these issues, who mobilize at the local level and community to community, neighbor to neighbor, and lift those same issues up so that you then build political power in Ottawa and can have some effect on those issues at a national scale.
It brings me back to actually the free trade and water thing, and I remember I got the brief copy of the free trade agreement, and it was so clear to me reading it that water was on the table.
Absolutely.
That it was, and yet the PR or the government was saying no, they're not going to be able to. But talk a bit about that. Has that?
Well, it's very much on the table, and not that long ago, British Columbia was being sued by a company out of California for refusing to allow them to purchase water out of British Columbia. And very much in places like Ontario, Nestle's has just sold their water rights in Ontario to another transnational corporation. And they get it for pennies on the liter and then bottle it and sell it or use it for the American public. And so, free trade essentially is the free is in reference to liberating trade. It means free of any restrictions. Right. And so anything that our Canadian government might do to limit or put barriers to other countries stepping in, or corporations housed in other countries stepping in and having full access to our resources, is considered a barrier and illegal under those free trade agreements by and large. They've been evolving a little bit over time, but there has been tremendous opposition to those aspects of them. And I don't think it's about opposing the idea of trading with other countries. It's about the exploitative nature of that, and particularly in terms of the impact on women, on workers. It can be very much a race to the bottom, as well as the resource extraction.
Yeah, that would be especially the water situation.
Yeah.
So you did not start in the labor movement.
No.
You started at Raycam, and when I heard that, the first image I had was the Raycam projects and how it looked like a prison to me with no windows. I don't know if they had windows, but it looked like they didn't have windows. Talk about the Raycam Center and the daycare.
Right. So Raycam Center is a community cooperative, like a community center built within the Raymer Housing Project, which has been renamed to Stamps Landing. Some people know about it because of the militant Raymer mothers story about women who actually camped on the railway tracks in order to force the railway company to first try and slow down their trains, and then they reneged on that, and they got an overpass built to take their children across to the closest elementary school in Vancouver.
You set up a time and you've run past that time. You set up another time, another half hour, and you're still going to cross over that half hour, then we've got to come out here again.
I didn't even know that story.
So look up the militant Raymer mothers story. It's fascinating. And so they also lobbied all three levels of government to get funding to build a community center. And so I started as a daycare worker in that community center in 1978. Because it had municipal funding, it got attached to the municipal structure and was part of the municipal union. And in 1980, there was a 14-week strike for all of the municipal workers in the Lower Mainland, both inside and outside, so no garbage collection, no community centers, all of those things were on strike, and we were, by association, part of that strike. And so 14 weeks on the picket line, I was walking with women who were in their 50s and 60s, the age I am now, and they were all saying, you need to get involved. And I knew nothing about unions except that my parents thought they were greedy. And so, I had no particular association, but that transformed me. And I'd shifted from being one of those regular union members who know I hold a union card, but not much more than that, to being a full-scale activist. And the rest of my working life was based on that.
So you had mentioned, just off on a side, that you had women mentors there. Was it from the labor movement or the daycare? And talk about your women mentors.
Well, the first women mentors I had were in the daycare. So it was a place that was, in the heart of the downtown east side, and most of the people who worked there had much more advanced political consciousness than I did. And it was my first introduction to sort of that inequality and people living in poverty who looked for somebody else who they could denigrate as at least they could feel a little superior to somebody. And I was really shocked by that. I sort of thought, well, you're all in the same prison of a housing complex. It did have windows, by the way.
Okay.
But I really thought people would have more of a shared experience and be more allied, you would say now, right? And that was not the case. And so I was pretty shocked by that. But I also had my coworkers who really had a much deeper analysis than I ever had, who helped me interpret this stuff. And they laughed at me later about how naive I was. But I'll give you one example of how much it was money where your mouth is, because my supervisor, there was three of us worked in the daycare, and the supervisor made $90 a paycheck more than the other two of us. And every payday she sat down in those little daycare chairs at the little daycare table, and she said, here's your $30, here's your $30, and here's my $30. So she divided the difference of her pay. Oh, wow. Her belief system was that all work has value and nobody should be making more because of a title. And so that was my foundation, as a 22-year-old.
That's shocking, actually.
You don't find that happen very often. Yeah.
No.
And she also invited me to the Army and Navy, where women's stocking shelves, shoulder to shoulder with men doing exactly the same work, exactly the same product, same shelf, were making more money than the women, which was illegal, but most employers knew to put you in different parts of the factory or whatever. It was pretty rampant. But we did demonstrations there for, I think, 3 Saturdays before the employer, Army and Navy, realized that they were shamed enough into changing it. So she, again, taught me, you live your values and you take action. And so that's part of what attracted me to the union when the opportunity came.
Why do you think, you mentioned your parents thought they were greedy, but a lot of people have this really strong negative reaction to unions. Where does that come from? What is that?
It comes from all sorts of places, and it's not by accident. I mean, unions are, I think, and not always very well used, I'll say that, I think are the most effective vehicle for social change that we have. In terms of having a voice and the ability to act together in unison for improving our situation, that's what unions do, and they lift up all workers when they do it. So whether you're in a union or not, You know, when wages lift and advocacy for minimum wage increases, all workers benefit from that. Occupational health and safety standards, all workers benefit from that. All of the things that unions work for their own members, they also advocate for other workers as well. And that's a threat to the employer. It's a threat to the employer class. And so there's basically a concerted effort to try and suppress that in order to maximize profits and to maintain control over workplaces and society. And, you know, sort of in a very small nutshell, it's supported by those who have power. The fact that unions have survived at all, I will say, is a victory. It's a success story because there's been repeatedly, over decades, efforts to actually...
Well, people got killed.
Many people got killed.
Fighting for... And it's also more than... It's to me, it's like we are all into, especially these days, I think, the individual rather than the group. Talk a bit about that.
Well, I think that's by design too. You know, the fact that we have been encouraged to move away from collectivism into individualism is it's kind of the, you know, we are dominated by the American dream in this country. We see a lot of that stuff slip over. The convoy movement recently is I think also kind of a taking what's going on in the U.S. and having it start to influence how things happen in Canada. And I think that whole idea about, you know, that you alone can, you know, pull up your own bootstraps and be successful. And it rarely happens. I mean, there are examples of it, but most people who have real wealth is because they also had an inheritance or they had a family situation, or, you know, if you actually look at what their roots are, very few people have been able to do that. And yet that's the idea. We're encouraged that, you know, that's how we should feel good about ourselves is to do stuff on our own. And I don't buy it.
Well, and it's interesting in contrast to the woman you worked for who split her money up and how that helps people. That just makes people feel better to do more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it absolutely encourages that.
So where is the labor movement in general right now? Because it seems to me, after the solidarity movement, we'll talk about that later, it seems like it's kind of just disappeared from reality. I mean, I know there's unions here and I know there's unions there, but it's not part of the mainstream.
Yeah, I think it's a bit picking up. I'm noticing CBC, for example, I'm noticing more often that they'll go to the spokesperson for the union and ask for an opinion, or they'll actually name them, which used to be, you know, just the union said. So I am seeing a bit more presence, but I would say that we've been in a very long slump. Union membership in the post-World War II period was about 50%. Of all people who consider themselves wage earners were union members as well. And that has been on a pretty sharp decline, and in Canada it's about 30% now. Most of those people who belong to unions are in the public sector and much less in the private sector. So it's also, people have really bought into that idea, if I do well, I did it on my own. So it's partly that. It's also, you know, back in the early 80s, late 70s, with the introduction of the new neoliberalism. So, you know, Margaret Thatcher took on coal miners in England and beat the coal mine union. And Ronald Reagan took on the air traffic controllers, fired all of them across the country and replaced them with people who had military air training or Air Force training. And those were unions who thought that they were unbreakable. And when they were broken, everybody else went, uh-oh.
Scared.
And really, it really kind of put a chill. At the same time, with the free trade agreements, the multinational corporations, when they said, we're going to move our shop off out of the country, they did it. It wasn't an idle threat anymore. Up until then, it had been. And so the whole shift became to just try and keep your head down and protect your own. And I would say, in retrospect, it turned out, I don't know what was what would be the better thing. Should they have really fought it and gone down fighting, but I think that, you know, for that period it really was inevitable that the unions had to kind of step back and reassess.
Fear.
But it was pretty legitimate. Now, you know, there are unions who see themselves as business unions who just do the grievances and negotiations and nothing else, and there's others who see themselves as social justice unions. They're the ones that you see out in actions and climate emergency rallies, those kind of things. They see themselves as part of moving forward on the community and the social justice agenda. That's my end of the spectrum. And I think that the more we do that and remind ourselves about actually involving members on a day-to-day basis, the more likely that we'll get back into more successful. But it's not in a great place right now. I totally acknowledge that, but I do think the potential is still there. Yeah.
And I think people might need a reminder as to, what unions did, what people did and fought for. I wanted to talk about mining a bit. And you had mentioned, I saw some documentary, I can't remember the fellow's name, who was a miner and tried to organize the workers.
You're probably talking about Ginger Goodwin?
And they chased him. I mean, I think they ended up killing him, in fact. But talk about mining, because you brought up something interesting about burying the dead.
Are you talking about the mass graves, or the unnamed graves for the miners?
No, that the miners first...
I know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. Yeah, so different conversation. So some of the very earliest mining unions in Canada were in places like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, where the minings were incredibly dangerous places, and so the death rates were very high, and so the first forms of unions there were really about raising money collectively to bury the dead.
I mean, when I heard that, I was like, really?
Yeah.
But talk a bit about that.
Well, it was so important to people, to the widows particularly, to have the community support them, because most of them were in company houses for one thing, and as soon as their husband was dead, they were kicked out of those houses. So now they have no income, they have no house, and they're probably trying to feed a bunch of kids with what? And so the community would come together to support them, and that was a form of unionism. And it comes out of the British tradition as well. That was part of the reason for coming together, is to realize that your work is so dangerous that almost inevitably somebody's going to be dying on a pretty regular basis, and that was one of your core functions.
And then there was I call it Off to Ottawa, which isn't the right term, the On to Ottawa trek.
Yes. So I brought a brochure about the On to Ottawa trek. So this was from the anniversary of the 60th anniversary from the 1935 On to Ottawa trek.
Sorry.
And it was out of a pretty long story. So this is 1935. You can think about the Depression, the crash of the stock market in 1929. And what happened was unemployment rates were incredibly high all across the country, and young 16-year-old men, if there was any form of welfare, it was called relief, and it was usually through your township. And if a boy turned 16, it was assumed that he was a man, and the family stopped receiving any relief for him. And so he became a burden to his family if he stayed home. So those young men left their families and tramped the country looking for itinerant work, riding the rails and going from town to town, whatever they could find, picking turnips or fruit, and they'd go all over North America actually looking for work. But they were also radicalized by that experience because, first of all, they were disenfranchised, and they were hanging out in camps where, communist influences and other people who were feeling equally unhappy with their state of the world would talk at night together, and their anger would come to the surface, and the government started to recognize that this movement was taking shape, and the Depression now 3-4 years in. So what they did was set up work camps across the country. They called them relief camps, but the guys in them called them slave camps, and they were in the same places as you think about the Japanese internment camps, deliberately away from urban centers, hard to get out of and hard to get into, and quite isolated.
And not seen.
And yet every family knew one of these guys because it was somebody's brother, son, nephew. There was a lot of sympathy for these guys. But they got paid 20 cents a day to do hard labor. And sometimes it was real work, like building City Hall in Vancouver was done with relief camp labor.
Oh, interesting.
This was one that was happened to be urban, but mostly it was just doing physical work to keep them tired. So it could be literally moving
So they
a
didn't
pile
get
of rocks
too
from A to
angry.
B and back again. Keep them tired, and if they took any kind of action, they'd be blacklisted, and then they could starve. Like literally, they would be facing starvation. Anyways, they organized into a union called the Relief Camp Workers Union. They called a strike and refused to do the work. The federal government ignored them, so they decided to go to Vancouver. And in Vancouver, they had what they called snake parades. They had tag days where you get a little tag on your collar to show you'd given money into their tin can, and a whole bunch of other activities. And then there was an incident where they went into the Hudson's Bay Company, and some glass shelves got smashed, and so the mayor got all upset and decided it was time to get these guys out of town. So he literally read the Riot Act. You know, you hear about, I'm going to read you the Riot Act. He read the Riot Act to them at Victory Square in Vancouver. And so they were like, okay, now what are we going to do? And somebody said, let's go to Ottawa, on to Ottawa. And the whole, it was like really one of those spontaneous moments. And so they decided that their issues were federal. They wanted the right to vote. They wanted the right to have a decent work and wages for that work. And they wanted an end to the camps. And so they decided they were going to take their issue to Ottawa. So on the morning of June 3rd, 1935, 1,000 of these guys climbed onto the box cars at the foot of down at the foot of Heatley Street in Vancouver. 1,000 young men climbed up on top of the boxcars, and they took their belts or a piece of rope and tied themselves on. And you can just imagine, the imagery of this to me just captures the moment when you think about this is a steam train, right? The steam's coming back. You've got 1,000 guys tied to the top of the boxcar. They're serious. They're serious, and they organized themselves into military units. So it was a certain number of guys as a unit on top of each one, and they had incredible discipline. And as they made their way to Ottawa, they stopped first in Kamloops, and Kamloops wasn't really ready for them. The next night they were in Golden, and word had gotten ahead to a communist sympathizer in Golden, and she had organized a community. So they pulled into town, and the park next to the train tracks was all set up ready for them, with including a whole bathtub. A cast iron bathtub full of stew on top of an open fire. Lifetime friendships came out of that evening. Anyways, they made their way as far as Regina, at which point the Prime Minister,
something bad happened.
No, something's coming. He thought that they'd never make it through the mountains. Like who would do that?
Or even last energy-wise,
exactly.
Probably.
But by that point, there was 2,000. Like it was growing momentum, it wasn't diminishing. And so the Prime Minister stopped all eastbound trains by the RCMP. He allowed a delegation of 8 to come to Ottawa to meet with him, including the leader was a guy named Slim Evans. Everybody had a nickname. So Slim Evans, when they met with Iron Heel Bennett, the Prime Minister, he accused them of having stolen union money because they'd sent some money down to Montana, where there was a strike, and the families were starving. So he sent some money down for them to buy some food, and so he was accused of stealing money to send that. To which these guys called him a liar. So the next day the newspapers were, Ottawa trekkers called Prime Minister a liar. And anyways, they went back into to Regina after a very unsuccessful meeting, and they went back on the cushions, as they say. So this is called on top of the train, but if you're inside, it's on the cushions. And they arrived back, and they were having a rally to receive them and hear what was going on. And a whistle blew, and these moving vans that were parked around the grounds opened up, and RCMP came out on horseback and bats swinging, and there was at least one of the trekkers was killed, as well as an off-duty police officer. They called it the Regina Riot. Yes. It was a police riot caused by the police attacking them. And that brought an end to the trek, but it didn't bring an end to the story, because the Conservative federal government was defeated. This had gained the sympathy of the nation. Not that much longer were the first beginnings of an unemployment payment scheme in Canada.
We forget where this stuff comes from, and it's been changed over the years.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, at first it grew to actually provide unemployment insurance for most people who needed it. And then when I changed it to employment insurance, that wasn't just an accidental name change. It really did change the shape of the scheme. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me because I was, as a child, very influenced by like the civil rights movement, in particular the States and Vietnam, Kent State, and it seems like people's backs have to be against the wall in order for change to happen. Is that, like it seems like in our culture, society right now, everything's just kind of sitting. I don't know.
Well, I think there's some truth. I mean, there's, feeling desperate often is the impetus to actually taking action. And if you have enough to be conservative, to conserve, right? If you actually have a mortgage, if you have a car, if you have kids, all of those things are huge disincentives to actually, that's why youth tend to be more radical, right? As they don't have as much to lose and as much sense of responsibility to what they have. But, compared to where we were in 1935, in the middle of a 10-year depression, I mean, these people were desperate and they were starving. And we're nowhere near that. And yet that doesn't mean we should stop fighting to improve things, because there's certainly lots of improvement we could still achieve.
I think so.
Yeah.
And tell me about, Native Indian workers, because you brought a whole bunch of stuff that threw me for a loop. So let's start with the...
I wanted to highlight that because, we tend to think about the labor movement in European terms and those brave souls who came over from England and other parts to colonize Canada, and it even was still based on this idea of finding an empty, what is it called, terra nullius, an empty place. So if you ever study colonization and stuff, it's really about this idea of if you're not Christian, it doesn't count. You're not actually a human. And so
that shows itself over and over again in history, doesn't it?
So labor history more currently is, I think, much more responsible at recognizing who was there before the colonizers and what was their work. And even the term indigenous economies is controversial because it has that connotation, but to me it's still the best term I've come for this, which is to say that there are, this is a book that was done by Rolf Knight called Indians at Work, which was written when that was still appropriate language. But it really captures the whole idea of what was the work that was being done by First Nations people in terms of fishing and commerce and trading and trapping, furs, mining, lumber, all of those employment practices that we've put a wage to were being carried out by people before the colonizers ever came. And so this is one example of it. This is a magazine that was done by the BC Teachers Federation as a learning tool. Well, this goes back to 1980. Now, how many unions were doing Indigenous rights work in 1980, and how much of the rest of our society? So, I take some pride in my movement for having had the foresight to look at things in a different way than was generally being presented, and to lift up the voices of labor history that had often been ignored. So those are just two examples, and a book put out 2 years or 3 years ago called On the Line by Rod Mickelberg. The first chapter of that is about pre-colonial labor. And what happened, though, is that...
So what was happening at that time? So when you'd say, Native people were, fishing and so what was the...
What switched?
What was the...
So the colonizers started to arrive and hired Indigenous people to mostly do the work for them and teach them how to operate in this environment, which people from England certainly didn't know how to do.
No.
They learned how to do it, but then they started carving it up into things like having to, if you wanted to fish, well, you had to have a fishing license, and became actually exclusionary practices that were structured in such a way that squeezed out the Indigenous population from having that work, and actually made it illegal for them to do much of the work that had been their tradition. And so we sort of think of it as a natural evolution. It wasn't. It was very much by design. It was very much a construct of the colonizers to say, first we learned from you,
Then we'll
and then we
from
took
you.
it away from you. Yeah. So I think it's important for us when we do this kind of reflection is to think back far enough to realize that so much of what the Indigenous people have always done on these lands and have continued to do really needs to be valued and has informed so much of how our economy has been structured as well.
We learn from our history, but obviously we don't.
Yeah, do we?
But it's interesting because in this case, like on to Ottawa Trek and the mining thing, it's important to realize people fought for the things we take for granted. How did you get involved in all the history, or was it a natural flow from being a labor activist?
Well, somebody invited me to a conference, a labor history conference in about 1983, and I just got really interested in it. I've always felt it gives me what I call a long view. And so, you said earlier, what's the state of the labor movement these days? Not good. But I know it's been better, and I also know it's been worse. Right. And so that, I think, allows me to have a perspective that I don't get kind of panicked about it, or, it's it kind of, okay, over time, like there's going to be ups and downs. And it also is on us to be strategic about, what do we do well and what do we not do well, and what works. And not to think that just because something didn't work or did work at a particular moment, that it would or wouldn't again, right? To keep trying some of those different things. But
like, for example, young people wouldn't have any perspective on any of that. You know what I mean?
Well, this book is a project that I worked on with the BC Teachers Federation about 20 years ago, and it's called Youth Unions and You, and it's designed as a lesson plan guide for teachers in our public system.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm also with the BC Labour Heritage Centre, and we work with teachers to design lesson plans that attach to required curriculum so that they can just pick it up and use it in the classroom in a really easy way. But I think,
does this bring fear into some parents or anybody?
I don't think there's ever been much in the way of complaints.
Okay.
I think, it's such a tiny part of what is educational. Yeah. It's presented in a way that matches curriculum, so it's totally legitimate. It's not any more biased than anything else is. But I guess I come to the view, I so often hear people saying, why don't we teach our kids this stuff? And I think it's equally important, and this is where my activism stuff comes in. I don't think they're particularly interested unless they have reason to be interested, and it's their own life experience that's going to draw them to it.
Yeah.
So I think that it's good to know it's there, but until they actually have an experience like being treated really badly at the workplace. Mm-hmm. Well, what's this about? And, how come I don't have the right to express my opinion? Or, for a while it was even things like having a tattoo or a nose piercing. You could be fired for those things. And, for somebody who has lots of tattoos and piercings, they would think that's absolutely ridiculous. What's that got to do with my ability to do my job well? But if you're interested, there's a whole history attached to every one of those things that, in terms of workplace rights or health and safety. I talked to a kid once not a kid, like a 17-year-old, I guess, who was working in a fast food restaurant, and every night part of their cleanup was to take the hot oil and take it out to the back to a dumpster. And I said, how hot is it? Oh, it's just, we just turned the heat, it was just off, we just turned off the heat, it was boiling 2 minutes earlier. And they have to take it out to the back door at night, slippery down some steps and stuff, and it was just like totally you can just see the accident happening, right?
Yeah.
And what a terrible way to be hurt. And so I said, what if you just let it be the morning shift's job to take the cold oil, and that's the first thing they do in the morning?
Makes sense.
And they were like, oh, like you wouldn't even think, because that's the way they're told to do it.
Right.
And they don't think that it's possible to challenge their employer.
Well,
and in fact,
I think there's a lot of situations, especially, maybe my perspective's a bit off, but I would say there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, there's a huge amount.
Like decisiveness between even employees or workers, I think that's happening out there.
Yeah. My point being, though, that I think it's when you have the experience that you then are interested in the history.
Right.
If it's given to you, if it's sort of
Available
made available
or-
to you, yeah. Otherwise, you don't even really think about it.
All right, the Muck
The Muck
restaurant.
So this was a restaurant in Denman Street. Denman or Davie?
I think it was Davy.
Yeah, and it was a native food restaurant that was really popular, and a beautiful interior. It was meant to look like a longhouse, and all of the staff were native. And this is a photo on day one of Christina Prince, and she was a server there and the spokesperson for the union. They joined a feminist-based union called SORWAC, SORWUC, and SORWAC had virtually no resources, but they formed because the mainstream unions were run by men who had no interest in women's issues. And so they said, fine, we'll do our own. And so they were on the outside of the mainstream labor movement. And nobody else would have organized Muck workers because it was, and turned out to be kind of a losing cause. Had the rest of the labor movement supported them, perhaps a different outcome, but it was owned by a very wealthy art dealer in Los Angeles who did violation after violation of these workers' rights. They went to the labor board repeatedly. Every time they won, the union won, but it just completely drained their resources and their energy. This strike went on for 3 years before finally collapsing when SORWAC went bankrupt and declared themselves insolvent and collapsed. But it's such a
Sad
there's so many
situation.
lessons to be pulled from this. Yeah.
What lessons do you think there should be pulled?
Well, I mean, I think it is about solidarity. I think that so many of the strikes that failed might not have had the labor movement actually acted in solidarity with each other. We do tend to sort of say, oh, that's your strike over there, and not to get involved. And there's even a kind of a creed about not stepping in on somebody else's picket line unless you're invited. And I'm thinking
some other toes or
yeah,
something.
and it's like, well, wait a minute, isn't this all
It should
about
all
us?
be the same thing.
And I think, the SORWAC lessons, there's people still are totally polarized on whether SORWAC is a good thing or a bad thing. And, their sense that the rest of the labor movement was not worth belonging to at the time was probably true, but let's get beyond that. So, and also just the need of people working in service industry continues to be crying out for having collective action and the right to belong to they have the right to belong to unions, but organizing in restaurants is virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So that's just a few of the lessons. So.
And what about the 1938?
Oh, the
occupation?
1980s. So I was going to mention that as well. That was, I laugh about, the Occupy movement that we had a few years ago because everybody treated it like, oh, well, this is the first idea anybody had to occupy space and take it over. But in 1938, what's now called the Sinclair Center was the post office in Vancouver. And the unemployed, I talked already about the Ottawa track and the relief camps. Well, the relief camps were in fact abolished after the 1935 Ottawa track. The Liberal government was elected, and one of the demands that they met was abolishing and closing these relief camps. But it didn't solve the unemployment problem. So now you had all of these same young disenfranchised guys without jobs, still starving. Anyway, so the unemployed were organizing themselves, and in Vancouver they made a decision that they were going to take over 3 sites and hold them. One was to represent public, and that was the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was on Georgia Street at the time, and there was a worry that they would destroy the art pieces, so they negotiated quickly with them, and they went over here to the Sinclair Center. The Sinclair Center, which was the federal government, as the post office. And then the third was private, the Georgia Hotel. And the Georgia Hotel quickly said, if we give you $500, will you go? And they said, yeah, okay. So they gave them $500, and they also came and joined this group. So this is 2 pictures. One is showing that after a month of occupation, the police finally said enough is enough and went out and cleared them out with tear gas and horses and clubs. And this was after they threw tear gas canisters. If you go into the Sinclair Center, you can still see the open space where they had held that space as the sorting center for the mail. And the mail continued. That was what I thought was really interesting. You had all of these guys who were sleeping on the floor and living and cooking and putting out a daily newspaper called the, what was it, the Sit-Downers Gazette. And that was sold on the streets, and the money was used to buy food, and women in the community would cook for them and bring them food daily, and the whole thing operated for a whole month before
as a
finally
closed community, kind of.
as a closed community.
Yeah.
The Vancouver citizens were incredibly sympathetic to these homeless, unemployed, transient people.
Who were trying to do something.
Who were trying to do something, and again, it's because everybody had somebody in their family, so the sense of responsibility was very different. I mean, I think about how people look at unhoused now, and that kind of like, I don't want to see and I don't want them in my neighborhood, that kind of thing. This was quite different. So, but it was a whole month of occupation in a prominent place before the police decided to bust it up. Yeah.
So what are you, like, you're involved in the Council of Canadians, but what else? Like, what are your hopes and dreams, or what's next?
Well, I do, I mean, a whole lot of my sense of purpose and self is tied up with trying to affect change, and I am an optimist by nature. I don't think you could do this stuff if you actually didn't think there was any value in, like, it has to lead to some hope to change, right? So I officially retired 4 years ago as the president of the Vancouver and District Labour Council, which was a full-time position, and since then I've continued on with governance work. So I feel a little weird that so much of it is Vancouver attached when I now have become a full-time Main Island resident, but with Zoom and everything else, it's totally possible. So I sit on several boards.
It's all part of the same.
It is, planet. and it's very possible to do it. So I'm on the board for Vancouver Community College. I'm on the Council of Canadians, which is Ottawa based, but I mostly do that from here. The BC Labour Heritage Centre, and I'm also on the board for Pacific Blue Cross, which is a health benefits carrier, which is actually a co-op, believe it or not. And,
is it?
Yeah,
because those are disappearing too, co-ops.
Yeah. So in terms of that kind of a organizational structure, but it is member led, and so the board is elected by the membership. So
what is it you'd like to see in the very near future?
Oh, gee.
Or what that you do, like, what path would you like to,
I think,
you know what I'm trying to say?
My own path is that in the next 3 years, all of these boards that I'm on, I will be finishing with. They have term limits on them, and so I can sort of see the end, that in 3 or 4 years I'll have finished doing all of those. And at that point, I'm interested in getting into doing some of the same kind of work at a local level, getting involved in Main Island. I haven't yet figured out what, but I have, over those 40 years plus, developed some skills around governance and structural change and those kinds of things. So I haven't figured out what it's going to be yet. So that's my own path. The other stuff, I'm doing some mentoring. I'm helping people who have followed in my footsteps to do some of the, figure out their own way.
Cool.
But I like, there's a quote that a friend of mine likes to use, which is this the path is made by walking. And so again, that just ties back to, it's always about doing stuff and not just talking about it. So the actual what, I'm pretty busy these days on what I'm doing, but and then it just feels like the world is in such a difficult place right now, and so a little bit of it's just sort of just taking a breath and appreciating that people have and continue to try and make things better. So.
Thank you for doing this, my dear.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, it was very interesting, actually. Really good. And thank you for joining us.